All right, greetings from the policy format group. I would like to first say a quick thank you to DCH and Kelly for all their hard work in making this happen. We really appreciate it. The policy format group's charge was to consider the exigence facing policy debate in relation to format. So we had some very productive discussions, and I want to thank all the participants in our group as well. Glenn Frappier from Gonzaga, Ben Voth from SMU, Kelly Young from Wayne, Matt Moore from UCO, Trip Rebrovic from Harvard, and Travis Cram from Western Washington. And special thanks especially to Travis, who did a great job agenda setting and taking a strong lead in our discussions. We really appreciated that. So we came up with what we think is a novel and hopefully practical approach to helping policy debate and even other formats defend what it is we do. The basic idea is to map the stages in debate: pre-tournament, in-round, post-round, coaching, things like that, to identify sites of student learning. So we're going to talk about exigence, student learning outcomes, mapping those outcomes, and then our reflections on the mapping tool that we've developed. And then finally, some recommendations on where we go from here to help assess that. So I'm going to hand it off to Matt now to get us going.
Hi, everybody. So part of the reason why we're doing this is that policy debate is facing a crisis of numbers. In the past 6 years alone, the NDT and CETA community have lost a third of their programs, mostly to other events, but a few are to absolute budget cuts. But when asked, why are you leaving these events for, why are you quitting policy debate for other debate events? The reasons almost always come back as quality of life, expense, travel time, et cetera, et cetera. From the director positions, it always gets translated out as it is hard to justify the cost per student of engaging in policy debate, because our returnables that we are able to take to the administration and demonstrate the value of debate is usually just asked, but per student, that's a lot of money. Now, this crisis is made even worse because at the high school levels, which is probably the feeding stock of our activity, how many of our programs depend on recruitment and bringing in, have also declined. 10 years ago, there were some 16 to 17,000 students engaging in high school policy debate. And then last year there was only 10,000. So these numbers are falling across the board for the activity, kind of engaging it. Part of the problem is not only are we having difficulty describing the benefits of debate in assessment language, but also and cost, but we are also facing kind of a third set, which is that both the COVID crisis has seen about half of the college debate programs say that they will lose money next year for travel. A third have said that they will lose money for coaching and those positions. And others, about 15% said that they are going to lose scholarship money. The other crisis that we face is there's a demographic crunch coming towards major universities, in that we will have fewer students writ large just because people are having less kids. So those are the problems that kind of are motivating a lot of things that we've been doing. And Travis now can speak to you all about some of the other kind of demographic effects that we're missing on, or that are about to hit us.
Yeah, policy debate programs have a tendency to only think through how can I keep doing what I am doing, and they lose sight of the ways that their student population is changing. And what we'll have in our research report for the proceedings is some research into some of the population shifts we're seeing on our campus. So it's not just anecdotal or what's up with kids these days. The evidence shows two specific things. The first is there's a generational shift well underway right now that's giving way between the millennial generation and and Generation Z. And while there's always hazards speaking generationally, the data is pretty clear and compelling that there are clear linkages between this generation's experiences and how that has shaped their values and also their expectations and their perceptions of what they're doing on a college campus. Generally, they're far more cost sensitive, both in terms of money and time. It's a much, much more diverse demographic, and they are also expecting support from throughout their institution in helping them to succeed in the goals that they perceive as relevant to them. At the same time, there's also an overall shift in a growth of a non-traditional college cohort. It's estimated that in a few years, non-traditional students, 25 plus, will make up about 73% of the higher education learning community in this country. So what we see here are the traditional pool that college policy has relied on for so long as the primary feeder into their engines is shrinking, as Matt has already suggested. But also every college in the game is also going to be getting more competitive with the overall shrinking pool of students, because that's one of the key ways they have to pay their bills. So in a lot of ways, programs need to reckon with the need to meet students who are already on their campus. And I think this echoes what the audience group has suggested earlier, that students are a key stakeholder audience. And that was one of the key missions of this group. And the other thing that I see from looking at this generational shift is that the new generation of students really is a paradox. Never has personal relevance, what can debate do for me, been so salient for generation, and yet it was so poorly misunderstood in terms of what debate can offer them. Fundamentally, the soft skills that are at the sort of heart of the high impact practices that Brian has described earlier, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, et cetera, are hyper relevant and needed for students to succeed in career advancement and employment, which is area of salience #1 overwhelmingly for this generation. And yet their generational outlook and their experiences at the K-12 level has not trained them to perceive or value these things in terms of where they're offered. And so the framework of how we would have responded to this exigence is through trying to identify the ways that teaching policy debate and evidence-centered debate can be more student-centered. And what that means fundamentally, in our view, is meeting students where they're at, but not leaving them there. In other words, if students are more keyed into the TikTok generation, in some ways, the answer might be to give them TikTok debate. In other ways, it's to make them more appreciative and aware of the options and value they can get out of a policy and research intensive debate practice. And so the key way we've shaped its exigence is how can policy debate programs, which perhaps should be actually stretched beyond this to be really, how can evidence and research centric debate programs generate better teaching strategies and formative assessments to put information in students' hands so they have a better sense of their growth as a learner through their time in debate. And one of the key architectures we've used for that is a student learning outcome system that also piggybacks off what Brian has already explored. I'm going to kick it over to Adrian and Ben, who are going to walk us through how we've made use of those student learning outcomes.
Basically, in order to kind of communicate to the students and also helpfully to administrators about the high impact of debate, we took the research working group's student learning outcomes, and shout out to them. We had some of them lurking in our group. We really appreciated it. Thank you. Which was a synthesis of the NCA and the AAC&U student learning outcomes. So our mapping work is informed by focusing on those 5 student learning outcomes to help make the case for how debate, the format of debate that you do, intersects with those high impact learning practices for both students and for administrators. So I'm going to walk through them real quick. First, with civic engagement, which is working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. Second, critical thinking. It's the habit of the mind characterized by the comprehensive exploration of issues, ideas, artifacts, and events before accepting or formulating an opinion or conclusion. Third, oral communication, prepared, purposeful presentation designed to increase knowledge, to foster understanding, or to promote change in the listener's attitudes, values, beliefs, or behaviors. Fourth, information literacy, the ability to know when there is a need for information, to be able to identify, locate, evaluate, and effectively and responsibly use and share that information for the problem at hand. And fifth, intercultural knowledge and competence, a set of cognitive, affective, and behavior skills and characteristics that support effective and appropriate interaction in a variety of cultural contexts. Now, there are some that debate has some other outcomes that we're still working on trying to capture, but I'm going to turn it over to Ben now to talk to you about how we think these intersect with debate.
All right, thank you, Adrian, and thanks to Travis organizing this group. Yeah, I'm going to try to kind of step you through this a little bit. I think the first thing every director, especially here, but hopefully those that we're going to reach further with these publications, things like that, needs to think about is that there are going to be almost certainly local iterations of those learning outcomes that Adrian just read off. So, for example, in our written report for the research group that Brian's leading, I've got SMU's, oral communication and critical thinking outcomes, but everybody needs to look on their campus and see what those are and adapt themselves to them. If you're ambitious, and again, nobody has this extra time, but if you can sit on that committee for the oral communication or maybe lead that committee, that's going to help your program in terms of what the university thinks is a priority. One final thing I want to say before I kind of hand it off, just that we did a lot of work on the learning outcome, but I also just want to allude to, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, that anecdotes and biographical stories are important. And AFA is doing some things, and I know Kelly's doing some things. I just wanted to share quickly an anecdote about James Meredith, a civil rights hero who was impacted by debate, and it's a strong narrative. Today is actually the 55th anniversary of him being shot in Mississippi in 1966 in a march against fear. Meredith is referenced in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail as an impending hero. In his 2019 biography, Meredith wrote this about his college experience. He said, 2 months later, the last paper required was entitled My Philosophy of Life. And the summary of my thoughts on political action was as follows. Why are men afraid to speak in a society whose very existence is based on freedom of expression? Why are men afraid to meet when the law says freedom of assembly is an undeniable right? Why do men call good bad and right wrong when they know it is its true nature? Is this freedom? My answer is no. Negroes in Mississippi talk about their constitutional rights. They complain that the law failed to dispense justice in a lynching case. Then he concludes, after writing this paper, this is the end of his chapter here. 3 days after that paper was completed, I wrote a letter to the students and faculty at Jackson State College, suggesting the organization of a debating group on campus. And 3 weeks later, the Jackson Debaters Club have been organized and its temporary officers selected. When you turn the page on this biography, then is his application to the University of Mississippi, which precipitated essentially nearly a second civil war in the United States. Debate made that happen. And that's a powerful historical anecdote. We shouldn't lose track of that as we kind of track the data and things like that we're doing this afternoon. But I'll just kind of conclude with that and now turn it over to my excellent colleagues, Trip and Glenn, who are going to take you further down this road of applying our MAP and our SLO ideas.
All right, thanks, Ben. I'll also echo the thanks, obviously, to Travis and Adrian for getting this going, and more broadly to Kelly and David for all the hard work they've put into to making that happen. All I'm going to really do for the next 2 minutes is just kind of walk you through kind of an artifact that we've put together to really kind of give you a map of what we're doing here. This is a work in progress. It's Policy Debate Assessment Map version 1.0. It's unfinished. There's many changes that we could make, and I'll certainly highlight some of those to you. I'd also kind of preface this with saying, I know for a lot of you, you're involved in your assessment on your campuses. You've sat on a lot of assessment committees, so you're real familiar with a lot of the things we're talking about here and how this process works. But I also understand that a lot of you aren't, especially if you're not on faculty, if you're a staff member, for example, or if you're a younger coach, you probably don't have a lot of experience with assessment. And so what we've provided you here is just kind of our global map. I'm old enough to remember back when we actually had maps in vans on the way to debate tournaments if you wanted to get anywhere that you needed to go, if you didn't already know the state or the city really well. So kind of consider this, and this was an analogy used in our group. What we're showing you here is kind of our global map, the big map of the state or the country. And what would follow up from that are kind of more micro maps, mapping out specific SLOs like civic engagement and critical thinking with the specific metrics of how those things get measured. But what the assessment map does is it really provides a process of determining where and through what experiences we can assess the outcomes that we've identified for student learning. And so obviously the first part of this is just figuring out what our SLOs were. And I think Adrian spoke to that really well. You can see those are kind of listed across the top in the number in the 2 row. Civic engagement, critical thinking, communication, informational literacy, and intercultural knowledge and competence. One thing I'll kind of preface here that Adrian didn't really speak to is we played a little bit with the communication SLO. We kind of had discussions about how we're not just trying to teach oral communication. There's a lot of written communication that goes into debate, as well as a lot of digital communication. And certainly, and I think this also speaks to some of what Travis was getting within the changes in our student body these days. They are multimodal. They communicate across a number of different platforms through a lot of different modalities. And so potentially this broader category of communication captures a little bit better all the different ways that we teach those modalities. So those are our SLOs across the top. Down column A is what we can call kind of the sites of learning. Where does this learning occur, right? Or where does learning occur in the life cycle of debate? This is a fairly comprehensive list, but certainly still incomplete. And I'll kind of go through it briefly and talk about some of the ways that we think it can be built on a little bit. I'll also say kind of when we got our columns and our sites, and we're matching them up with the SLOs, the way we do that is through this scale that's on the right. What we were doing is just kind of gauging it. So just to start with the top one, if I was going to say, okay, civic engagement, where does this show up? Writing topic papers. Can we assess civic engagement, what they're learning about civic engagement at that stage of the debate process? And we would evaluate that based on 1, 2, or 3. Is it possible that we're learning something in that site? Is it likely, or is it strong? So 1, 2, or 3 is the way we would map that out. Other assessment projects use different kind of descriptors to evaluate the degree, or whether this is somewhere where you might introduce this concept versus develop it, versus expect a mastery in the students of a particular concept. So what we did for the sites of learning was break that down into pre-tournament, the actual debate rounds themselves, the post-round decisions, the RFD, and the end of tournament, kind of transitioning to the next tournament, and then the social elements and competitive elements of debate. So again, these are sites, right? These are places where we can look for evidence that learning is happening. And so pre-tournament, we came up with things like writing topic papers, the research that goes into debate, the construction of the arguments, the team retreats and work sessions, the team building exercise, skill building exercise, coaching feedback that happens during that phase, and certainly practice rounds as well. One thing we talked a lot about is how we break down skill building exercises, because those are unique, right? There's different learning outcomes that we might be seeing evidenced in speaking drills versus rebuttal drills, for example. And so that's something where the work can still be done. Then we broke it down into debate rounds. And so you can see kind of pre-round preparation, the constructive speeches, the rebuttal speeches, the cross-examination, the active flowing, strategizing in debates, audience adaptation, and then extemporaneous responses. And what I mean by extemporaneous responses is kind of like that on-the-fly thinking. This was kind of the term I could come up with that best captured that idea that was being talked about in our group. From there, we kind of looked at post-round decisions, RFD, oral comments, written comments, discussion, post-round. These are a little bit difficult because these aren't necessarily obviously areas or sites where a debater's doing something, right? And so this might be a little bit more kind of a long-term evaluating learning that's occurring in the oral portions of decisions, or the written comments judges might provide, or the question and answer period that follows the decision and the explanation. We turn to end of tournament. So we're looking at things like, patchwork, iterations of existing arguments, innovation of those arguments, targeted refutation, coaching feedback that happens during this process, practice debates, and redo speeches. And then we kind of moved into the social elements, the non-competitive elements of debate. So tournament locations, traveling, the cultural content programming, the peer-to-peer interactions that happen, the experiencing and building of community that can happen not only on your own squad, but certainly, that's a big selling point, obviously, for in-person tournaments, is that we build communities there, which it's harder to do online. Weekly meetings, event planning, public debate events. So things like actual public debates, or some of the activities that Ed was talking about the other night in his presentation, as well as alumni interactions. And again, those are just some of the places that we could identify. I think that list is incomplete at the moment. And one thing we did find in our earlier version of this, everyone on the committee kind of went in and we filled it out, 1, 2, 3. And I won't show you that page because we couldn't digest all that data in the amount of time I have. But I think what that very brief informal experiment showed us is that debate really is a high impact activity. that all of these can be measured at a number of different places, a number of different sites that we've identified, which I think is really important. And so I think I'm going to turn it over to Trip now, and Trip's going to talk about kind of some of the value of this. Because like I said earlier, not everyone does assessment. Not everyone's involved in a university assessment. I think young coaches in particular aren't aware of this. You know, we assess our teams a lot of times based on wins and losses. How many speaker points did you get? How many awards are you winning? But we don't necessarily take a moment to really assess kind of the micro level learning that's occurring, I think, in a lot of these different places that we have the opportunity to measure. I'm not sure if this got posted anywhere yet. So in the chat, I'm going to post the link to that map. Like I said, it's a work in progress, but if anyone would like to go ahead and, start using it, play with it a little bit, see how you can adapt it maybe for use on your own campus. It's there. It'll be changed from time to time as we kind of move forward in putting these proceedings together. But I hope you find it useful. And we wanted to make sure we gave you something to take away from our group now rather than kind of waiting in the future. And so for those of you who haven't filled this term in yet on your conference bingo card, this is our deliverable. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Trip to talk about some of the importance of why this mapping project and broader assessment project matters.
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks everybody else. So yes, I'm going to kind of some of the benefits of using this tool. And I think there's three to start out with. The first is the obvious one, that it's a tool of assessment. So who are you assessing and what? And we think kind of at the beginning, it's a way to assess a bunch of different elements of your team and say, are they fulfilling their potentials? And it allows you to look at, kind of examine in granular detail things that may not consider before, and also look at it in kind of an overview bird's eye perspective. The second thing, that the kind of going through this process, it only takes a couple of minutes, but it's very helpful because you see things in new relationships that you might not have seen before. So the cross connection of the different sites and the different SLOs, some things that you may not have noticed before become obvious, and some things hide away. So like one of the other conclusions that our group had in the first iteration of this was that speaker points don't create any of the SLOs, like basically not at all. And so, it's not on this sort of thing, but this chart kind of helps make some of those things clear and able to explain to things. And so someone's going to talk about sort of what we want to do about that later on, but kind of that's where we reach that conclusion. And so actively filling out this thing is very helpful. And then the third thing is, this is something that you can easily present to someone in your administration and say, here are all of the different things that our debaters are benefiting from. Like, here are all the numerous sites where they can benefit. And you can kind of say, and it also enables you to track over the course of a few years, here are the different ways that my debaters are improving. And so one of the other ways in which we thought in our discussions that assessment could be used is for students to have evidence of their own improvement that's not just tied to tournaments, but that if we can create categories of assessment that aren't grades, but they do become rubrics and metrics that we can use with our students to say, have you improved X, Y, and Z? And then that becomes data that's presentable to the administration. And then a couple of comments about this as well. One is, so we're going to have some pre-populated SLOs that are like ready, shovel ready, that, if you're in a crisis and you say, I need some SLOs to present to somebody that are all filled out, we'll have those. And we'll also have them blank, as Glenn said. And just want to make sure that everybody understands that even though we just presented one for policy, we think that this life cycle is applicable to multiple formats. And you might have to tinker with some rows here or there, but that in general, this is a framework that can be used for any kind of debate format to make the case for here's how it achieves these objectives. And then the last comment I had about it is that you can kind of fill this out with different perspectives. One, kind of assessing, well, how are we actually doing right now? Is our team fulfilling these objectives? Or kind of another one is as a potential, like, well, what in an ideal world, if the coaches are acting on their, if they're doing their best and the evidence, whatever, what could we do? And so you can sort of see where there are gaps. And so that's that. But just the moral of the story is that, even if you're familiar with SLO, or if not, this quick exercise reveals a lot of things.
All right, and then the last item from our group is just future steps that Travis and I will cover. The first thing is, towards the end of our discussion, we realized when we were doing that mapping exercise that we tend to speak too generally about critical thinking, information literacy, and communication skills. And I think it hurts our intended purpose, that when we just sort of describe a benefit of the activities critical thinking, for instance, it puts us at a same level as perhaps a English literature course or a singular course in the university. And it doesn't reflect well enough that we are a high impact, high intensity practice in critical thinking, in information literacy, in communication skills. And so one of the things for the publication that you'll see is that we went and looked for more advanced and more granular models of critical thinking, of information processing, and and communication broadly, that we think that debate really nicely syncs to and can make a stronger case for all of those various elements on that map. Because when we were filling out the map, you would have like high-end kind of strong connection, intense connection. In the most common sort of category, it was like critical thinking, information processing, but it didn't give a clear picture. So we've done some work on that. We also believe, and Vic was just asking a question about this, about social emotional kind of non-competitive elements that we are doing some of the thinking about, like, how can we measure or account for those elements? Because during this conference and before, I've been recording interviews with alumni. And one of the things that I've immediately found is in those recordings, one of the questions that I ask is, what's your favorite memory of being in the activity? None of them have reported particular wins or anything like that. It's all been community building, teamwork, leadership. And, that's something that a lot of our metrics fail to properly account for. So that's something that as a deliverable that we are hoping to spotlight to get more information about. And then the last thing that Ben Voth already talked about a little bit was that we need to clarify DEI and figure out kind of its proper location throughout a program, because some of that is perspective and aspects of the competitive aspects of what we do. Part of it is the social elements, but it plays a really central and foregrounded role that I don't think we acknowledge nearly enough. And so one of our suggestions is ways to think about how central it is in what we're doing in many unacknowledged ways. But now I'll turn it over to Travis.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kelly. And the elements that I kind of want to highlight in terms of what our report will detail, but also what a few of our deliverables for the website will also be geared towards. It seems that if our goal is to give more tools that are relevant to students and put that information about their performance in their hands, competitive debate is doing a remarkably poor job, because there's two primary data points that students get with any regular consistency, and it's the win-loss binary and a utterly meaningless 30-point scale. And so it's very clear that the move for the future is there needs to be clearer, trackable, formative and cumulative assessment feedback for student learners that allows them to make sense of how they are progressing relative to their goals. Because nothing about any of research we've done about student populations suggests that winning versus losing is a relevant, salient characteristic for them, but they nonetheless come to the table with a lot of things they're looking for, and we should be developing formative assessments that close that gap for them so they see the relevance in debate and understand its power and view it as giving the time. In terms of some of those specifics, we will be recommending more precise ballot measures for recording student performance in use of evidence, refutation skill, communication skills, and community building, whether that be collaborative work with a partner, community building across, the opponent, other moments that community manifests. These are possible adaptations of what we have done in the Pacific Northwest format. This is what we have done instead of speaker points. But we would propose that this data is on the tab room ballot, but not necessarily linked to the competitive bracket. So we don't have to deal with the messy question of, what does it mean to affect seating, or, what do these variables mean? But it does enable data accumulation that's much more targeted. And this allows a couple things. The first is you could recognize student achievement in any of these categories. There could be a top award for, the best student in community for XYZ weekend. But more importantly, this is a quantitative statistic that students can track over time, and they can also compare their performance relative to other students. And it's also in the categories that they think they need, whereas they don't have any way to translate that out of a 30-point scale right now. We also are going to recommend the consideration of assessment track tournaments, especially at the end of a semester, both for the fall and the spring. So for example, trying to radically alter the ballot should not be done overnight. And it's going to require building a culture of assessment among the sort of competition pool. But one of the things that we could do, perhaps in the spirit of the classic Wake Forest experimental tournament, is use that in its late November schedule as an assessment tournament where we collect data on student performance relevant to achievement in the core learning competencies that we've kind of outlined here. A similar thing should be done in the spring as well, especially for those novice students who join in the winter/spring term. So they also get data in terms of understanding their performance, especially if it's a student who isn't built for a 4-year competition, but maybe is thinking about doing debate for 1 term only or 1 year only. Other things we're recommending is trying to promote a culture of assessment. And just as the generation we're serving is paradoxical and contradictory, a culture of assessment matters both in novice and JV for probably very intuitive reasons, but it also matters a lot in open as well, because I think there's sometimes a premise that open debaters don't need these targeted sources of information or don't have these same pressures or concerns going on in their head. And that hasn't been the experience of even some of the top programs that we've heard feedback from in terms of how they've seen student incentives change over time. Lastly, under discussed, but I think a rich area for exploration, the most significant place where a lot of policy program resources are tied up in is the significance of coaching your students and the intensity of that coaching occurs, and where so much instructor feedback occurs. And currently it's not captured at all. There is in many ways zero record of these sorts of interactions. So the big challenge going forward is how do you record teaching activity of your coaches and produce some sort of recordable, identifiable information that students can improve off of. We kicked around some initial ideas today about how learning management software systems like Canvas could be a great engine to accomplish this goal. But this is still in need of some more theorization. To conclude, we want to bring it back to the format charge that this group has, because at various points in time, this group both was and was not the policy format group. And so we want to put format squarely kind of in view. And so Kelly and I each have a kind of key takeaway related to format. My takeaway is that debate organizations need to do a serious look at their practices and the current status quo model of tournaments. I'm not arguing in favor of ending policy debate or ending the intense, rigorous structure of policy debate. In fact, I started a policy debate program this year during COVID because I'm utterly convinced of the benefits and what it can do to help not just some students on my campus, but I think that it can benefit all. However, if we are seeing that more and more of the students that we are expected to serve have zero interest in our current model, we do need to have some hard conversations about what we can do to adapt that model. The AFA's role in that is relatively limited, as are the members of this committee, even though we come from policy program, because we are not also the same, we both are and are not the people who are driving the competitive practices, making those decisions, setting those agendas. We need to make sure that all the relevant decision makers are in that conversation. But overall, the policy community, from where I stand, needs to soberly assess what it offers relative to who's perhaps buying it. And I'll allow Kelly to kind of close out our whole panel.
Yeah, and the final point that's been brought up now at a few places within our presentation is that we need to reflect on how our programs produce both access and rigor in relation to the very points that Travis was just summarizing, that at a certain level adaptation is inevitable, but how we balance the demands that are going to be imposed upon us by the student body that we have, yet maintain the rigor of the format that we all find valuable and that we think is important to student learning outcomes that can be mapped in what we previously talked about. I mean, that's really the ultimate challenge going forward, and that is animated so many of the conversations, not only within our group, but across this conference. And so, our emphasis point will be to use your program student learning outcomes as the guide to decide, is there an adequate balance between accessibility for students and their particular needs, and to explain to the students what the outcomes of your program are, and to maintain a certain level of academic rigor. And with that, we'll conclude our group. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. That was a lot of really interesting information. I look forward to reading your report. I think in the interest of trying to conclude close to our end time, I'm going to suggest that we move on to the instruction group, which I know has a lot of really useful materials for us to talk about.
Hi all, I'm Jackie Popes from George Mason University. I'll be presenting for the instruction group. Our group focused pretty heavily on attempting to create, and I'm having some presentation tech, attempting to create kind of an arsenal of teaching tools that a new instructor, or possibly even a coach who needs to kind of reinvigorate their own toolbox when it comes to coaching new students, could use in the upcoming years. I would like to thank the people that were a part of this working group. It was delightful both to learn about different coaching models people were using, but also to just have long conversations about debate that honestly got me excited about where we could go in the future. So thank you to my co-chair, Danielle O'Gorman from Navy, and our other working group members, Natalie Benny, Ned Gidley, Allison Harper, Scott Harris, Mike Janis, Shantae Jordan, Amran's Revlins, and John Turner. So what we kind of put together was the idea that we needed a working plan to construct I want to use the word Dropbox, but not necessarily have to be on a Dropbox, kind of curated amount of information that people can use to instruct. So lessons plans, PowerPoints, lectures, etc., which I'll kind of explain as we continue on. But with that plan in mind, we kind of tackled the idea that this was a 4-part project. We had to identify different categories of instruction that need those tools that people could use. The second was to collect and curate that repository of instructional information. So the kind of largest point that was being made as we began was that these tools are everywhere. Every coach at some point has put together a PowerPoint of X under idea. Every Urban Debate League has some amount of information that you could access on their main website. I know NSDA does something similar, but the question is, can we curate this to the collegiate audience? And can we make it something that a new or emerging coach or someone else could use and have everything in the same place? So the third thing that we really wanted to focus is not just providing things like the syllabus for that plan or drills for this, but also identifying best practices that coaches could keep in mind when instructing students about things within those categories. And then finally, conclude this with the idea that there are going to be gaps in this curation, so inviting submissions from coaches in the collegiate community abroad. So the recommendation that we ultimately had is this should be posted on the AFA website. And then I know ADA and CETA have both expressed interest of posting it on their own websites. So with that in mind, the 6 categories that we ultimately discussed within this was the broad one that I think is kind of the most understood, that we need to teach debaters skills, and we needed to figure out what those categories of skills we need to instruct are so that we could formulate those lessons, etc. The one that we focused a lot of time on, and I think that a couple of the younger people in our group want to produce the paper for it, for the self-interested idea that we could have a publication, is the idea of teaching the teachers. This was the one that we spent a significant amount of conversation about. What are the things that new coaches don't know when they enter the activity as an administrator? How do they need to talk to students? What are things that they need to learn themselves before they encourage their students to do learning on the other side. Argument types was another category, i.e. the different things that we have to teach debaters that are not necessarily skills, but more so the vocabulary of debate. Debating across the curriculum or applying debate within classes, because I know everyone has different ways of doing this. So providing some sort of framework for people who are maybe teaching their Debate 101 class novices for the first time. Models of engagement, i.e. how can students promote different levels of engagement peer-to-peer? How can we have different styles of practices that bring a novice debater and a varsity debater together in one room to learn from one another in different ways, etc. Transitioning from debate styles was the last category, which focused on maybe pulling in ideas of what it means to move from a UDL high school circuit to debating in college, or debating in high school in the public forum realm, and then moving over to policy when you get to college. Same thing with like transitioning from LD to policy, or any of the different events and how they kind of complement or distinguish from one another. So after we identified these categories, the largest kind of conversation that took these 2.5 days or so for us was talking about subcomponents within each of these, i.e. if we were to coordinate this large kind of database for people to use, what are the different types of skills that we have to teach, and how can we coordinate effective tools within each of those subcategories? The next was more of a, I guess, autoethnographical conversation that happened throughout the weekend, which was where have we failed at coaching in each of these categories? What have been successful metrics? And the final thing was, if you were starting from scratch, what would be the things that would be necessary to include in each of these to make teaching debate possible? Why did we kind of construct the group this way? The idea is that we have a lot of people who are like graduate students who become a coach and have no idea what they're doing. I can say that as from myself, that was pretty much where I was, thrown into accidentally teaching novices and unsure what I was going to do with that. But we also have people kind of on the maybe later stages of their coaching career considering adding younger novice debaters to their programs, and what that means for changing instructional modes. The goal of all of this kind of coordination of groupings was that we would have in the end those guidelines that we could provide, worksheets, drills, and documents for every section that we identified as important kind of teaching nodes that we end up having to use. So with that in mind, I'm going to move over to providing kind of an example. I figured it was going to be way too long of a presentation if I went through every kind of folder that we plan to add into our arsenal. So the first was when we were talking about the skills grouping, we had started with this list that I've provided on this screen of the different skills that we think are pretty inherent to teaching debate. And the ones that are often a struggle. So the one that took up a long period of conversation was this idea of how do we teach research? Debate is this event where we brag about our research capacities, but it can often be the most arduous thing to train a debater to do. Flowing and note-taking, etc. I'm not going to read off this entire list. But once we had this list coordinated, what we're hoping the project will ultimately look like is something like this. So this is the example specific to teaching research. So the idea is that the deliverable for each of these subcomponents will be, there will be a teaching best practices document. Some ideas of what that could look like, or the bullet points that would be within that document for research specifically, are on the left panel, i.e. talking about how it's easier to teach research in smaller group settings. If anyone has attempted to teach research to 25 to 30 new debaters, you know it's not the best setting to have that many people in a room trying to share a screen and showing them what tools they have from the university library. The second is that We could emphasize things like one-on-one mentoring when it comes to research initiatives. Being able to see someone in a smaller setting like that do research can often be a very useful tool to learning how to research. A third component that would be in this best practice document for the research teaching module would be the idea that we need to focus on bringing in other administrators within your school to that process, like librarians. I know a lot of people within our group talked at length about the positive measures that their librarians have been able to give them about teaching research, using their university databases, et cetera, and having the students learn from the experts. As much as we often want to feel like we're experts in everything about debate, a librarian probably knows a little bit more about their university database than we do. The next is noting that learning research is a process of mapping out goals and how that can take the stage for every level of research that you may be teaching. Planning out a specific document of or file that you want to teach may have different levels to it depending upon the skill level of the debater that you're talking to at that moment. And then the final thing in a best practices document within the research category could be advocating for a scaffolding approach to learning, which identifies the first being that debaters, when they're first starting to research, may not be able to find an article that says an argument. Instead, the first step to that process may be providing an article and having them find the arguments that are in the article itself, so that once they have at least a marginal amount of experience with that, they can move to the next step of the process, which is giving them an argument, having them find an article. And then the final step to that scaffold is give them a chain of arguments, have them find the chain of articles, so that by the time they've gotten this amount of experience, hopefully they can be a little bit more independent in things like file production and research. So beyond the best practices document, the idea for each of these categories is that we will have a curated article, i.e., go through all of the things coaches have written about teaching or doing research, Research 101, essays, pick the best one. Identify that as the one that can be used, have the rest of those be supplementary things within a separate folder. The third thing we would have is a similar approach. I know on my side, telling novices, go to YouTube. There have been so many camps and they've all taught disadvantage advanced lectures if you want to go to the next step of learning how to go for a disadvantage. And then they say, I found 8. Which one should I watch? And I'm just like, watch them all. Not really the best strategy if it's one that you want to have just everything organized and ready to go. So the intent is that we will do that work at the beginning so that it's easy to access. You see an article that is both at the introductory stage and the intermediate or advanced stage, so that you have access to those 2 videos that you can trust are useful. The next would be an accompanied PowerPoint, and then finally worksheets and drills dedicated to that specific subject area. The nice thing is that, like I had mentioned before, a lot of this is already available. The problem is that it is not in the same place, which I think we've noticed in a lot of the other conversations we've had from other groups like the research group, is kind of indicative of a lot of things about debate, is that a lot of people have done this work and it's all over the place and we need a specific place that we can put it. So beyond the second thing that I kind of wanted to focus on was that section that I had identified as teaching the teachers, because it is very difficult to learn how to coach. It's something that you have to get practice at in order to become even competent at it in the first place. So the idea is that we have outlined I have 4 examples of subcategories that we had for this section, and I wanted to talk through each of those for you. The first is that I know on a personal basis, I would have loved to have a handbook when I became a coach on the George Mason debate team. And this is not something that I think is as common as it should be. So a recommendation that we are pushing from this group is that institutions or debate programs should have their own handbook for coaches. I know that we have this handbook often for debaters or members of the team, but not one that takes the more administrative instruction lens. What do you need to know before you go to your first debate tournament? Or what do you need to know before you start interacting with students in the first place? So within this, the idea for our deliverable is that we would provide a list of what you could include in the handbook. Obviously, this is institution dependent because my rules at George Mason for something like, I don't know, where I take my student if they're having a mental health crisis might be very different than what that information would be for a different university. So the recommendations here is that it outlines official duties, which I think is also important on hiring like professional level, as often debaters who move over to coaches are not even told what their official duties are. They're just expected to kind of jump in and do what they're told to do when they go to a debate tournament and coach. And probably not the best aspect, since we have, if you compare it to faculty members, when you apply for a job, there is a list of duties you're expected to perform. Unofficial duties, things that you can kind of expect might happen while you're in your teaching or coaching capacity, and then university policies and important info. Things like contact information for people on the team, the quote unquote, in case of emergency procedures. So what happens if you're at a tournament and one of your debaters has a, I don't know, needs an appendectomy, what do you do? Van procedures, hotel procedures could be within that. Any passwords that you need everyone on the team or coaching staff to know, dates and info for tournaments, where it's just a non-exhaustive list. The idea would be that we can get a couple handbook examples from either institutions that already have them, or I know everybody within the group that we were in already said we need a handbook for our team and we will put one together. So this next example, and this is where our kind of what we can provide would be different than what you saw on the earlier slide, where it was very focused on if you need to teach X skill or idea, here are all of the things you would need to do so. This is more so, I am about to have to perform a coaching duty and I don't have the slightest idea, or maybe I want different approaches for how to do this. This section kind of gives it in the idea of how to pre-round coach or pre-tournament or post-tournament coach. The concept here is that we'll provide individual essays from the people within the group of how they perform pre-round coaching. I know we've already, that's the one thing that we spent a lot of time working on already. And the perspectives were varied. Everyone has that different approach to what they do. And I think it's helpful to see people from different institutions, peer institutions, or larger, smaller programs, and what they do when it comes to those activities as they have to perform them as a teacher. The concept that we had for judging a debate and giving RFDs, I wish I had been given any amount of coaching before having to do this for the first time in my life, was the idea of pulling from Kelly's interviews that they're doing with alums from debate, is in an interview series with great, and I'll put that in quotes because I think that is an adjective with different meanings for different folks, great judges, people that are highly preferred. How do they judge? And how do they construct their RFDs? And we could accompany that with examples from NDT final ballots, which in many cases have already been published, so they can see kind of how people approach the activity of judging, because it is an element of coaching, since there should be an expectation that you are teaching. The final aspect that we talked about a lot, which I think is very important in an age where debate is declining, is how to recruit. So within this category, the best practices document is what we will focus on mechanisms that you could deploy to get more people on the team, with a focus both on recruiting high school level debaters, but also on how to get people on your campus who have never heard the word debate before or don't really know what it means, interested in the activity of debate. So those were kind of some examples within the teaching category of what we plan to produce. I I skipped a slide. We have a final recommendation. It actually came quite late in the game as we were talking amongst one another, but it was us bemoaning the fact that there is not some sort of institute for college debaters. We used to have the ADI when it was at its finest. I remember when I was an undergraduate debater, I was afraid of flying, so I didn't go, but several of my friends went to ADI and learned a ton. And the struggle that I know as a novice coach predominantly I experience is that when you have new debaters, the idea of sending them to the first tournament of the year that happens like 2.5 weeks after they have started school can be quite daunting, and oftentimes they are not ready. So something that we would like to provide as a suggestion or recommendation is the idea of a debaters debate conference. We're having one right now and I've learned a ton. So I think it would be great to have something similar for new debaters in the activity of college debate. Freshman and sophomore was the idea that we could have over a weekend and structure it like a tournament so that they can attend and learn the things that they would have to know to prepare for the season. Because I know some institutions have the capacity to do this, but other institutions do not have the capacity to do this, which creates a certain barrier to entry in the novice or junior varsity levels if you're competing against a team that was able to have a week-long preseason with their new debaters before they debate it in novice. So the idea is that we could even potentially suggest having this on top of the first tournament of the year for the novice and junior varsity division. Saturday through Monday structure. Entries could have a 3-round, instead of judging obligation, have a 3-round teaching obligation. And we could have novices with a specific curriculum and JV students with sign-up sessions for things they think they need to work on, and finalize this with an end practice debate for everyone that participated. So that was a little bit different than the rest of our structure, which was largely that we're going to be producing that repository of information and tools. This is the largest example we had of something we would love to happen that we don't necessarily did not plan yet on a deliverable, but rather a recommendation. So that concludes the things that we worked on. I could definitely open up to questions. I know that we've got a large amount of our members here who could also answer them. And I'll try to stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jackie and Danielle. It looks like folks are just impressed and don't have any questions. I know I am. Brian DeLong is up next and is going to be presenting information from the technology working
group. Okay. For the purpose of time, we had recorded a video, and it turns out we went over time. And so I'm going to do it live. And by that, I mean live editing and a little bit of paraphrasing, because I know that we're reaching the end of the conference here. So I'm going to play. You'll listen to Arnett a little bit. But if you see some moving around, that's what's happening. Oh, let me, of course, share it appropriately. Video, share sound.
In early March of 2020, I was at ADA Nationals in Las Vegas. When we landed Thursday, March 5th, I had no idea it would be the last in-person tournament to date. By that Saturday, it had become evident that an in-person NDT was unlikely. By that next Wednesday, the NBA season was canceled. Flights from Europe were banned, and Preet and Shah had convinced me that we could host the Tournament of Champions online. Adrienne also promised she wouldn't quit. Over the next month, I got to watch an incredible group of people come together under extremely stressful circumstances to pull off something that many, at least at the time, were pretty skeptical about. Over the last 15 months, we've all been part of one of the largest innovations in our field, from cards to briefs, mimeograph to Xerox, hotel lobby newspapers to LexisNexis, tubs to paperless. The digital debate moment will not and should not be forgotten for its contributions to our activity. When facing an existential crisis, the debate world responded. Now the question is what happens next? And this was the mission of the technology working group this weekend. And while our discussions probably raised as many questions as they answered, an important conclusion is this: digital debate can make important contributions to the growth of sustainable intercollegiate debate programs. And while the devil will be in the details, approaching the subject with intentionality and an open mind will be critical in moving this topic forward. So much of our past 15 months has been in crisis mode, just making it day to day, tournament to tournament. But the goal of this conference and this group was to chart a course for the future. I want to thank our working group, Brian DeLong, the rest of the group who made great contributions to this presentation in a forthcoming publication. It was really a fun discussion and frankly inspiring to work on something positive after such a long year. So, online by the numbers. For those who missed the past season, there was a lot of digital debate. There are plenty of shout outs to be given to those who have been working on digital debate for decades. Gordon Stables at USC, Jim Hanson's Climb the Mountain initiative that's been running college tournaments for around 4 years, Wyoming that hosted an online policy tournament the year before it was cool. But in terms of scale, last season was obviously something different. Some of the numbers are really mind-blowing. NSDA campus had 1,200 tournaments last season, 92,000 rooms. Classroom.cloud reported 75 million minutes of debate this season. The entire college policy season was online, 37 tournaments, including the first ever online national championships. Some notable things about the TOC and NSDA Nationals. For the TOC, this past online TOC had 70 more schools than the largest in-person version. And for NSDA Nationals, they'll have over 2,000 more students than their largest in-person event. And so I think, you know, for context, this is really quite important. We divided our discussion into a few main areas: online debate platforms, best practices, and program building. And for our presentation, we're focusing on program building, but the other areas will be part of the public.
Right before the, okay, this is where I insert myself to speed this process up a little bit. Just want to piggyback off of Jackie's recent presentation about the dispersed information that we have across the interwebs. One of the problems with technology is that we can speak from a lot of places, but if you're speaking from everywhere, you're essentially speaking from nowhere. And so one of the suggestions that I've had so far is what's called the CRM system, or the classroom management system that we all use on our campuses, whether Canvas, Google, you name it. And so one of the suggestions that I have beyond just accumulating things into folders or anything like that is to actually make an exportable model of a Google Classroom or a Canvas classroom. And I would need to know what other formats are out there for professors that are teaching where we can meet students where they're at. So piggybacking off of the audience group as well. So if we have the ability for students to use their iPhones, their iPads to quickly and easily go through a module format to look at videos, lessons, plans, quizzes, then we can better track their educational outcomes, but as well as line up educational outcomes across institutions. So that was one suggestion that I had in terms of learning from within this Moodle. Indiana University, in turn, let's see. Okay, back to Arnett and his university for a 4-year degree. They have monetary incentives for that, but also educational ends associated with it as well. And so the sponsorship and mentorship programs that Dave will cover a little bit more and how to do that outreach with high school, middle school type programs. But in a collegiate setting, we absolutely can easily open up our squad meetings to help expand debate opportunities, either with this CRM model or within the Zoom meetings that we already are currently integrating into our systems. I'll hand it back over to Dave.
Right. So beyond opportunities for online learning, there are a lot of possibilities for harnessing digital debate competitions to increase participation and contribute to program building. So when we talk about hybrid possibilities, there's a number of different ways to think about it. Hybrid schedules, where you have some entirely online, some entirely in-person events. Online divisions at otherwise in-person tournaments, or integrated divisions with online and in-person competitors and judges all at the same tournament in the same division. In reality, it wouldn't be a surprise to see all of these in play over the next few years at both the college and the high school level. And I know there are a lot of conversations happening over the course of the summer that will determine some of this. This group had a lot of opinions. And while there was a lot of agreement in terms of the role for online, the value of online and hybrids, not total agreement on which system. And so I suspect there'll be a lot of trial and error over the next few years. And I think that's probably a really good thing, that we practice our innovation and learn as we move along. In terms of digital debate circuits, this is another entirely new possibility. And one example is a project I've been working on called the Collegiate.
So just to pause here, essentially the slide that's coming up next shows that there's absolutely a shift in opinion on online debate, given Carly Watson, the director of debates, work at Michigan State. So I'm not going to rehash this. Some of you may have attended prior conferences where she presented this, but the purpose of this was essentially to say that there's obviously some concern, but there's no way to put this genie back into the bottle. And so we have to figure out how to integrate it into our overall planning, going forward. And then he hands it back over to me.
Some of the most comprehensive data we have to date about online debate. And of course, a lot of our opinions and ideas are emerging. And over the next few years, I'm sure we'll have a lot more data to look at. But a few things to highlight about what we know now. We see strong support for the idea that online debate can boost participation, especially for programs that are geographically isolated or have budget constraints or a number of other issues Brian's going to talk about in a minute. But there's less agreement about what we do with that. Around 50% thought tournaments should stay on, some tournaments should stay online. Another group thought hybrid possibilities should be made available. But the bottom line is very little think the genie's going back in the bottle. And so online is here to stay, and it's a question of shaping it in productive ways to maximize participation. In terms of cautionary results, I think the important thing that stands out is a concern that online tournaments can harm the community aspect of debate. And that's something we'll speak to more in our recommendations section.
So one of the issues that our committee absolutely wanted to emphasize is the access benefits associated with online debate. And so clearly geographic limitations, the Mountain West, and even just distances amongst universities in that area provide, a means of those institutions to attend almost any tournament. But that doesn't mean that because a tournament is online that it necessarily is directly inclusive. And so evaluating time zones and thinking about the impacts that this may have, let's say on West Coast Pacific time institutions versus East Coast times, and in locating a means in which maybe West Coast tournaments can be hosted and East Coast teams adapt to them, are all things that we considered and will write about within the papers. There were some benefits also identified associated with for students with disabilities. Let's say that travel can be harsh on their bodies or may have chronic illnesses. Limiting the travel schedule to a few online tournaments may be at least one means of both retaining but providing a better balance for those particular students. Work-life balance is something that matters significantly. So for many of you that engaged in these online debates, you were able to go home and sleep in your own bed and maybe maintain positive relations with significant others, family, children, you name it. Okay. There are some considerations that tournaments need to think about in terms of audio visual, and we are working on producing a kind of how-to or best practices document that is accumulated for the purpose of this this working group. But a part of that in terms of the discussion is if you have somebody with a hearing impairment to the point that visual communication through subtitles are the best means of displaying an argument, is that on the host institution's responsibility, or is it on the institutions that bring the student to those tournaments? And we didn't have I think a universal agreement on all of this, but at least something that tournaments now need to start considering more as technology adapts the activity that we're a part of. Travel bans continue to exist, and even if institutions have the monetary means to attend tournaments again in a post-COVID world or a post-adaptive COVID world, we still have institutions that cannot expend money within a lot of red states that have identified anti-trans legislation, for example, whether the program wants that or not. And so there is an argument about the necessity of being adaptive, of having hybrid models of tournaments, or inclusion of teams who would like to attend but otherwise physically cannot be there. And finally, I want us to think a little bit about some of the problems that we've had with brick and mortar tournaments in the past, where teams were unable to attend because of weather-related events, or maybe even travel events where a plane was canceled because of mechanical issues. There is the possibility, even if you want it to be a brick and mortar tournament, where being adaptive and allowing for online competition to occur, where we can avoid those unnecessary buys or retain an inclusion of those teams at that tournament. Okay. We came up with a few ideas for alternative tournament models, and this is not by any means exhaustive, but at least talking points that we covered within our group. One tournament style was the asynchronous tournament that had been around for some time, given some limitations with broadband and things like that. Our participants were not excited about the asynchronous tournament model, partially because it's like herding cats to both get people to submit their videos on time and their response videos, plus finding judges that are willing to watch an asynchronous debate all the way through. Essentially, it's a way of piling a lot of additional work on that piles up, and then somebody needs to process that information. There is a benefit of having a mandatory time for people to be in one place, and then having judges in that place. It ensures completion of that whole process, and something to think about. We don't want to say asynchronous shouldn't happen, because I teach a class that relies on asynchronous to be able to occur. So it can be more inclusive, increased participation, depending on what you seek to gain. Next tournament, hybrid divisions or with hybrid limitations. And so it is possible to host a tournament that has an all online division component to it, and an all in-person component to it. How you deal with the judges and how much of that judging pool is shared, where some judges in person are judging, is something that a tournament will need to come up with. One innovative suggestion in order to resolve the question of why would somebody fly or drive to a tournament just to debate online is that tournaments, in all likelihood, to incentivize travel, are going to have to create limitations on how much online cross online debate is going to happen. And so that could be, we will limit online debates to 2 maximum within our schedule if you are in person, or you set presets will have all online debaters debate each other, and all in-person debaters will debate each other, and then out rounds will be a mixed bag. Another possible limitation could be a cap on how many online participants there are, in order to ensure that you can at least meet those requirements. There's another model where you can establish a partial online tournament as a means of qualifying for in-person round robins, or maybe a smaller form of those tournaments. Now, this can be beneficial for those of us that are losing funding to travel students. And so you can have the online aspect with the incentive of do well at this tournament, and you'll be able to travel to wherever that may be. Extended time period tournaments are something that may open up the possibility for those students that don't have the ability to travel to a high intense Friday through Monday type of a competition. And so what I imagine with something like this could be 1 or 2 days over the course of a week in which 1 or 2 rounds occurs. And then the following week, you do that again. And then the following week, you do that again. How long those tournaments last, are negotiable amongst the teams that will participate. However, it could be a way of, especially those students that are working jobs, or maybe they can only make 1 meeting a week, in which that tournament will then provide you an opportunity to, have a chance of winning an award, gain sanctioning from organizations, but it does beg some questions about the rules of the organizations as they're currently written. So from what I gather, CETA Nationals, or CETA as an organization, will allow you to be inventive with this type of tournament style. I think ADA is the same according to my conversations. But then we do run into problems of attrition and loss of debaters over the course of those weeks. And so it begs some questions about organizations and whether or not we're going to be rules-based in including or excluding certain partnerships, or if we want to be more open to innovation in terms of the sanctioning and approach for points for those competitions. Classroom model, I already tapped into that a little bit. Maybe agreement. So we're reaching at about 6 o'clock. So I'll speed up this process as well. One of the things that I mentioned at the bottom here was modeling intelligence squared debates, that the public debate aspect of this technology is massive in terms of reaching additional alumni. We had a K-State debate, and we had more people attend the K-State debate than we've ever had attending online debate during COVID than we've ever had in-person debate. The last thing that I suggested is that universities may enter into contracts with other universities that would interest their administration in the end. And those contracts are akin to what happened with triangle debates back in the turn of the 19th century when intercollegiate debates started. And so I suggested, for example, IU and Purdue, in our rivalry between the institutions, could be a type of online debate that's cheap, doesn't tap into your travel budget, but gets you both the alumni outreach, possible judges, and things like that. In the sake of time, I'll paraphrase some of the other things that we also covered here. And I specifically wanted to talk about the benefits of collegiate activities in high school and middle school outreach. And so Dave Arnett eloquently covers this, and it'll be a part of the publication in the end. They have a Bluegrass initiative where they are establishing public forum programs in places in Kentucky that haven't had debate in a long time. The University of Wyoming, with Matt Liu in his initiative in managing to get about 14 schools to participate in both tournaments and coaching events. It takes up one night of their week, and he dedicates a graduate student to that purpose. But as Dave mentioned in his presentation, we're only as strong as the recruitment pipeline that we have available to us, whether that's on campus or in high school. And so if you're looking for a relatively cheap means of having a drastic impact and proving the worth and the significance of your program, this could be one means of doing it. Whereas instead of traveling 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours to various cities throughout your geographic area, the students can come to you online. And I think it's an incredible practice, and one that IU seeks to model moving forward. And we hope that other colleges kind of follow pace. So I'll go ahead and stop there. The video will be available if you want to watch the entire thing. My apologies for having to cut off, some of the material, but that is the gist, plus the paper that we'll be putting out there. Thanks.
And we'll make sure that the video is made available to everybody. And we plan on doing the same with the 4 panel presentations that we had over the weekend. The last group that's going to be presenting today is the Planning and Program Development Group, which is one that I had the pleasure of working on with Al Highland, who's not with us today, and several other folks. And our presentation is going to be a bit more just describing what's available. We plan on showing folks the work that we've done once we put together our Google site. Sorry, wrong button. All right, can folks see the slide deck? All right, thank you. So I'd like to thank the members of the working group. They have produced quite a bit of material. Their names are listed here. They will also be listed in the proceedings. But a lot of good work was done. The global plan for our group is that we're going to produce first a Google document that collects materials in a number of areas that are designed to facilitate both the creation of new programs and to make it easier for new directors to transition into a director role. We divided those up into 6 different groups. And our plan is to have members of each of those subgroups provide a brief pitch for why the materials that they plan on including are going to be useful, not only for folks here, but that you should be directing graduate students or other folks to as appropriate. So one of the groups that I worked with was with Eric Morris is on labor and hiring practices. And what we plan on developing are a series of checklists that you can use for things like calls for DODs and ADODs, plus working through a number of training initiatives. And this falls in the category of necessary but unknown things that I was unaware of when I first became a director. And so our hope is that although you probably will not be able to just strictly print off or copy paste the materials that are provided, it will still be of great service to you when it comes time for you to rewrite your own job description, if you're lucky enough to do that, or lucky enough to hire an assistant director. And similarly, similar checklists and ideas for graduate student recruitment, and then also graduate student development. A second work group, we had a number of people that were working on this, is creating materials that are designed for planning and new program proposals. And this includes a wide range of materials, including those focused on student clubs, which D8 was generous enough to provide several how-to lists for, team management materials, top-level planning initiatives like how to budget across the season, how to plan a travel schedule based on the geographic locations of tournaments, different maps that are designed to give you an idea of how, give folks an idea of how different program models work. And I think that the value for experienced directors would be to be working through, or rather to provide what I think is a significant gap that exists in the debate community, is that even among experienced directors, we don't share a lot in terms of the how we run our teams. And I can tell you from my own experience that I have gained very, very important insights that have improved my coaching and the functioning of my program simply from side conversations that exist at tournaments. And so our hope is that the materials that are provided here may duplicate or work in areas that you may already have prepared documents. Will give you alternative models and practices against which you can compare how it is that you run your own team. In addition to this, Michaela and some other folks worked on putting together program advocacy and save our program types of materials, which involves creating a series of letter templates that are designed to answer the call that we too frequently see on social media. My program's budget is threatened. Where is articles about X value debate, or how is it that we can mobilize a campaign in order to provide support for our program? And so we are producing templates and kind of models that one can use to take advantage of that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Vic, who's going to describe briefly some of the budgeting, or the case for the utility of the budgeting and funding materials that they put together.
Huge shout out to Al Highland, who did the amount of this work, and Sam Babney for contributing to it as well. But essentially, we produced a lot of practical documents for people, assuming folks who are starting the budget process maybe for the first time in their coaching career and have to kind of think about this in a new way. in their coaching work, but also for departmental use or just reimagining your budget process if you feel overwhelmed by it. And since you're all debate people, I'm fairly certain you can read bullet points at this point. You don't need me to read them out loud to you. But we did provide a bunch of logistical suggestions, how-tos, and we included some budget models as well. Al and I had a fun conversation about our low-end small budget with $20,000, and then there's a mid-sized budget and sort of a larger boutique budget, because Al said that we shouldn't produce a public document that encourages anybody to give us less money, even if I know how to do that. Because that was the irony of this group. I am a person who never has any money. Putting me on the budget group seemed weird. One of the other things we included was tips for tracking budgets. And one of the things that came up when I was working on the student club-based program development documents was understanding something that came out of some of the presentations we've heard about how certain things are not debates at universities. And people need to think of the budget as a question of topicality and not impact comparisons. It is a line-by-line question. It is a question of a priority. If you don't have a budget, you can't travel. If you don't have a budget, you don't have people. So how do we orient those materials in a way that sets us up to actually have our programs? We're still working on a few materials, which is the next slide. And just very specifically, we're putting together also some sample grant materials, some just a separate on its own budget checklist document that you can go through, a budget Excel template for directors who are maybe starting from the first time, tournament hosting budget samples for income or breaking even, and then even some materials on how scholarships in the budget. And we're going to put a separate student activities sample budget in there. And the reason is because student activities-based programs often ask for some kind of contribution from students versus your departmental or coach-led program where you should be covering all costs. And you have to think strategically as a student about how you can demonstrate that you're contributing financially to your program, but actually not putting a financial burden. And then each of those how-to notes in like transportation and the kinds of things that are part of the budget, the housing, the hotel, the paying for judges, also has a separate either justification notification or how to create a justification suggestion or specific notes for different kinds of programs so that you understand how to interpret that based on your specificity. And obviously we would love more feedback. If you've got samples you're willing to share, it would be great if you could send them to Al. If you have feedback in terms of justification or just how the budget is done, I'm really willing to look at that work. And then next we have
John Katsoulis.
I work with David Steinberg in developing action steps for new program directors and how to promote campus engagement with key stakeholders and also to more effectively communicate with kind of alumni. There's nothing revolutionary in kind of what we did. We offer kind of practical kind of recommendations that might seem obvious to people who've been in debate, but for somebody who's new to the activity, I think the suggestions we have are good. We have a lot of specific recommendations. David Steinberg came up with a lot of ideas that the University of Miami uses to generate on-campus publicity, such as they have a University of Miami logo that they've kind of branded with flyers, and they distribute these flyers at all campus events that provides publicity for their debate program. So we're going to put in the Dropbox examples of the logos that the University of Miami has kind of created, kind of demonstrate the effectiveness of branding. Then we have suggestions about tying the mission of the debate program to the university's mission. Other groups have kind of talked about that already. We have a lot of specific suggestions on holding on-campus events to expand publicity, including holding tournaments, public debates, student forums, panel discussions, international debates. There are specific instructions on how to hold an annual banquet at the end of the year. When I was at UMass as an undergraduate 40 years ago, Ronald Matlin had this really exceptionally successful end of the year banquet. And so I kind of like laid out all the specific steps on how you would like hold an end of the year banquet, which is a good way to draw in faculty from the department and the deans kind of to attend it. The other thing that's useful that I did is we created 3 templates for writing press releases. We have one template specific to an after tournament template. So if you do well at one tournament, it has kind of a good template for writing a one-page press release. Then there's another template for the end of fall semester template, kind of summarize what your successes in tournaments for the fall. And then we have another template for an end of the year kind of template that's kind of different kind of features to it. So that's kind of useful. And then we have examples of press releases, real press releases that people will be able to access in our Google document. Then I couldn't resist in doing something about alumni outreach, communicating with alumni. So I have a template for writing an alumni newsletter. I've been writing an alumni newsletter for 20 years at BC. And so I have like 20 story options in the template for you to write an alumni newsletter. And I also threw in 3 examples of BC alumni newsletters that you can look at as kind of examples. And there are links to our website. You can go back to look at all the newsletters I've written since 2001. So all these action steps are all kind of self-explanatory. I just kind of highlighted kind of the more, just some of them. So they're all kind of self-explanatory. Fred Sternhagen is next.
This section is strongly influenced by my personal views about program evaluation. So I'm going to start with a little personal credibility work. You should be asking the question, why do I care about Fred Sternhagen's views on program evaluation? And my answers to that center on my background in this. My doctoral dissertation project centered on program evaluation methods. I have graduate coursework in program evaluation, and I have published in that field. So I think I have some knowledge that's beyond the average on that. The second question that might occur to you is, why should I listen to somebody talk about this whose program died under his watch? If that question has not occurred to you, let me assure you it has occurred to me continually, obsessively for the last 16 months. And part of the answer there is that there were things that I knew about the process that I took for granted, which were a problem. That is an indictment of my implementation, not of the conceptual framework. Another answer is that there was an administrator involved who I have come to believe had a personal territorial agenda, which was very, very difficult to deal with. Okay, so I think there are things here about program evaluation that would be very important for you. I start by saying asking why should you care? If done correctly, the process should improve your program. You should care about that. And if you don't develop your own process, I think somebody's going to make one for you, and you don't want that. I emphasize here the difference between what I term program evaluation and assessment. Many people have mentioned assessment. We, of course, know that words are not inherent in terms of their meaning, but a general meaning for assessment is measurement, and program evaluation is broader. It deals with, in the literature, questions of merit or worth. It centers upon judgment about value. And that, I think, is an important orientation that changed things. And David, could I have the next slide, please? Yes, I'm in control. Okay, the orientation of this work is not about having a particular product. It is about a process which is strongly influenced by Roger Skake's theory of responsive evaluation. The program evaluation people think they're their own discipline. They have their own graduate programs, they have their own conventions, they have their own journals, and there's a lot of theory and research that happens with program evaluation. And it comes about, I think, saying a lot that you need to be thinking more about what happens in a particular context, in a particular situation, in a particular institution, rather than thinking you can take some like general Procrustean bed and put any program on it and stretch it to fit. I think there's a lot of research literature that indicates that that's a problem. Okay, then if we move on. So the basis of the work has 2 parts that were done. The first is a 5-stage process that you would follow when doing a program evaluation. So that will be shared with you. It talks about the steps that you would go to try to identify the questions and modify a process for your particular institution and your particular context. That's based primarily upon Stakes Works and some other people. And then also Jake Justice did a questionnaire that talks about learning goals that could be assessed, which we think obviously should be part of what happens. Now that connects to a lot of work that was done other places. You've heard them referenced. And I think it's important to make those kind of connections. There's some stuff there that I think is probably better than we were doing, and that we can make connections there. I say that we are hopeful there are other more developed instruments. You've heard some of that work here. You heard that there are things that have been done by other groups that talk about learning objectives in many areas. That's going to be very useful. I would also at this point say, I think it's important for us to think about going beyond self-report data. We should not be fixated on not using self-report data. It's obvious that student evaluations of courses are very influential upon many campuses, if not all of them. But that doesn't mean that we can't do better and try to actually measure, assess what it is that we think we're going to be dealing with. And I think that kind of work, coming up with instruments which really measure the outcomes, is going to be important. The next connection I would make is, you might have remembered that Brian Lane was talking about having a group of external reviewers. And I would say to that, first of all, yes, great idea. But I would urge that it be people not only with debate knowledge. You've heard that I've talked about the program evaluation, literature base and theory base that can be accessed upon there. And I think it's important that we think about also helping people within programs to build ongoing processes that are really relatively continual, rather than thinking only about an evaluation at some periodic time every few years, whatever and stuff. Most of you who have read anything about this will think about the difference between a formative assessment and other kinds of assessments. So I think that's kind of the basic overview there. I think that it's important for people to be thinking about evaluation in a sense where you think about the questions that are going to come, not just from the top, not just from what might be called what is often called a Tylerian view of evaluation, which says you start with assessing only the goals that have been established for the program. There are other issues that are out there. There are other issues you need to find. You need a process which help you will uncover those questions and then provide answers for program decision makers that matter. So I think that's the short of it. We hope we'll have some stuff that's useful for you later. Done.
I already thought Fred had credibility, but I appreciate him adding more to that. I am known as a serial deserter, y'all. When I go to meetings, regardless of how great the content is, if there's a whole bunch of it at once, I am very, very often that person who will exit stage left as soon as possible. So thank you all to everyone who kind of hung out and stayed for this last presentation, and I respect you for it. In keeping with the general theme that's been made about not focusing on championships and things, when people are thinking about whether or not to remember and think about this work and process, please keep in mind that the folks together this week, and I'm not very good at math, so I need somebody with a lot more experience to find out the actual number, but they have at minimum at least 300 years collectively of service to organizations in high-level positions and service at their universities thinking about these issues. And so the outcomes, the impacts, the things that people have talked about from that should matter. As far as why you should look at these materials in general, unless you have a $5 million endowment that's throwing off $200,000 a year, so you're set economically, and you are considered at your university on the same level as a basketball coach and football coach, you need to be looking at the materials that were developed this weekend. So that's everybody in the room except Scott Harris. Scott can look at it if he wants to, but everyone else has to pay some attention to what's going on. In program participation and recruitment, big shout outs to Samantha Gopi, who was principally helpful with this. Really appreciate her work. Fond leader of what John was saying, we're not going to go through our specific documents, just a few things that we want to highlight and want people to think about. The first one is the concept of marketing your debate team is much larger than holding a club fair or putting up a couple of flyers. We need to understand not only the changes in demographics that have been discussed by several other groups, but the notion of how we think about debate as an activity and what we are offering to to our students so we can meet them where we are. There is an interesting reflection we also need to do, which is included in one of our documents. There is a marketing series of questions based on a business model that's been translated to debate. It's just 8 or 9 questions. It's very short, but allows you to think about your mission and your branding and some of the justifications you're using for your debate model and why you think people should support it. I would recommend it to everyone, and I think that will be extraordinarily helpful to folks in just reassessing their programs and helping new programs also get started. The second document that I want to talk about in that same type of quandary ties in to a question all y'all are asking. We produced some amazing materials in our group, and so did several others. All of you are saying, I'm not going to read all of this. I do not have time. There's too much on my schedule. I have camp starting in weeks. We knew that before we got here. That is not news that you're not going to read all this. But what it might be news is there are ways that you can recapture your time. And we have presented a time management document that talks about that. There is not enough going on our campuses around the concepts of automating services so that we don't have to send the same email to people when they ask the same questions, and of delegating our responsibilities to assistant coaches and students that need to be empowered. Of course, you're not going to read all this, but have your students or your assistant coaches go through 3 or 4 of the sections and report back to you right at the summary. Now, some of you might be wondering, but Will, they're going to be horrible at it. It doesn't matter, you weren't going to read it. So let them at least do it and learn something and then share that with your groupings. It is important for us to develop an understanding of how to do that. The notion of the disconnect between us and our campus partners ties also to our concept of time. We aren't spending enough time with the people that we need. We're busy fighting for funds when we should be busy finding our friends. The panel in the fall that featured Carla Leeper and Ed Panetta and Tim Hines and others, and the panels that happened here, both remind me about the extraordinary disconnect in language between what we talk about in terms of what's important and what makes our programs great, and how administrators think about those things. We have to do better on that, and we have to think about it and work with partners that reflect those goals and the operations of the programs that we see. The last thing requires a quick shout out to Kelly. He said something at the very opening meeting that stayed with me, which is the notion of we need to be forward looking about how we are thinking about this and how to implement these elements going forward, not only for new program recruitment, but engagement across platforms and the other things. The first idea I had related to that when Kelly said, and I raised this to Dave, and he was accommodating enough to kind of push it forward some, is the notion that the proceedings are lovely and it's a great idea, but we have to be able to also have these as videos and other methods of communications that these younger coaches and the people starting program are more likely to use and read. How many of you all would say if I gave you a 30 or 20 page manual versus said, hey, watch these 2 YouTube videos for 13 minutes, would pick, oh yes, well, I would love to start with the manual. That's just not reality anymore. We need to have adjustments and have our communications reflect that. The second one is on the issue of new program development. Fred raised this in our meeting. It was important, and it was echoed by DCH and others, that all of us have had mentors and people help us along the way, and that one-to-one contact will be essential. We have created a great array of new participation materials and ways to support new directors, but we need to do more. We need to move people forward and help them with that. In order to do that, we need live bodies available. And so our group also has put forward a proposal to suggest ways of having virtual coach consultations available, either as walk-ins or other means for the people that need them. That's a quick summary, and thanks again to Dave and Al for their leadership.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Will, and the other folks in my group. And that is our last presentation. So folks have made it through 3.5 hours of brilliance, right? You know, Kelly's My Original Plan had a little more extensive set of closing remarks, but in respect for everyone else's time and you know, because of the eye strain that we are suffering, I just want to share a couple of thoughts, one of which will underscore something that Will Baker just said. I'm really grateful for everybody that devoted their time both this weekend and in the preparation. You folks are my friend, are my colleagues, you are my friends, and greatly, I hope I will be able to see some of you at tournaments at some point this fall. But with what Will said, echoing Kelly, these conferences tend to be reactive, and we need to be much more forward-looking. And a takeaway or something that that I've come to understand as I've been in a director's role longer and kind of looked at how governance works, is that the thing that I think more than anything else that is broken about college policy debate is the activities that sustain, what Habermas or other Frankfurt School folks would call the life world of debate is not adequately rewarded. So things like governance, training graduate students, building cultural norms that allow us to work productively with one another. That work happens, else our tournaments would not exist. But most of that work is done by a very small group of individuals. And frankly, we are burning through and burning out directors and leaders in our community because the work of sustaining debate as a discipline, as a community, as a set of tournaments is not being done. And I think that one of the primary reasons why we have set up a structure where we rely upon significant efforts from relatively few people is that the demands of being an argument coach or getting your students to the next tournament or recruiting the next debater are immediate. I know I certainly felt this when I was a younger director, that I felt like I had to address all of those things before I could start looking to other things that were, kind of lower on my priority list in terms of sustaining my program on campus, the community around me, et cetera. And I think an important takeaway from this conference, and something I would very strongly urge folks to consider, is that the work of sustaining debate through all of these types of initiatives that people have discussed today ultimately falls on our shoulders, and that we need to be willing to embrace saying no to some of those immediate demands or handing those immediate demands off so that we can individually devote more time to sustaining the life world of debate. Because I honestly believe that if we do not do that, if more people do not step up to do that, this might very well be the last NDT-centric professional development conference that we have. So again, thank you folks so much. I miss you, and thank you for being here.
And if you'll bear with me just a little bit longer, I have very brief comments as well. When we envision something like this, you don't really have any, you have a vague sense of what it might look like. And, honestly, had I realized how much we were going to discuss stones and cabbage, I would have made AFA branded stones and cabbage as conference swag. But in the reality, I had no idea how well this would come together. And what amazed me is how well the presentations, the working groups, and the final reports have synced together so well. Our opening concern was, well, there's repetition. And I think what ultimately has been produced is great synergy around very complex problems that require a lot of different perspectives. It's really amazing what comes together when you get such talented, intelligent, and hardworking people together. And so I want to thank all my colleagues for serving as presenters, group leaders, and participants. Just really amazing work. I know it's been tough, but I really appreciate people that have really gutted out a long couple of weeks to join us. I'd like to thank the ADA, CETA, and the NDT for co-sponsoring. And I can't give nearly enough praise to my colleague, David Kram-Helwich, for co-hosting with me. This has been a very long but stimulating and enjoyable weekend. I am so happy that we came up with the idea to host a development conference. And so this thus concludes the 4th National Debate Development Conference. Thank you all. And we really look forward to seeing the chapters and the other products that we can pass on, as a